whole flock of silly geese. Welcome back to Ground Zero Salem. I am your host, Pat. So, got one more stack, one more video to talk about all this kind of hard-edged, somewhat metallic, tough New York hardcore or New York hardcore-centric kind of shit. I've been on a huge binge of this stuff for the past couple of months. Actually, these last 3 updates and this one is all stuff that I kind of feverishly bought around the same time. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about it and not just do a diarrhea of the mouth style kind of CD update and blaze through stuff. So I kind of sectioned it all into different topics. This last pile here isn't regional. What it is it's all collection holes that I wanted to fill. Records that I've been familiar with, most of them anyway, for quite a long time. Just through hearing them for years. Some of the bands I've had on comps forever, streamed, downloaded, whatever. But I wanted to have physical product, so filled those holes. A few that are kind of new to me, a little less familiar, but whatever, you get the idea. So this is all more or less classics that I wanted to talk about. And at the top of the pile, for a fucking reason, is Killing Time's Brightside. This is a lot of people in bands, important bands like Madball and the like, sick of it all. A lot of people's favorite record, or a very influential record to them for a reason. The 87 to 89 era, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts with interviews, and I've read the New York hardcore book. There was a lot that changed then in that particular scene, and there are a few key bands that really had a lot to do with the sound and the culture kind of evolving and changing, in some people's opinions for the worse, some people's opinions for the better. Things certainly got a lot more violent in New York in those days, according to everything I've read. CBGB's getting shut down, a lot of fighting, occasionally guns and knives being brought to CB's and L'Amour's and all those clubs. But Killing Time was kind of at the center of all that, musically. I'm sure they weren't happy with shows getting shut down more than anybody else was. But this record really kind of set the blueprint for a lot of the way hardcore would sound in the 90s, I feel. Involving and kind of pushing metal into the sound in a way that a lot of the crossover bands didn't do. A lot of the crossover bands, you could hear metal part, hardcore part, metal part, hardcore part, blazing solo, a lot of time changes. A lot of those bands from that era, Cryptic Slaughter, Ludacris, if you want to go to New York with it, kind of had a lot of like slow, fast, a lot of changes and a lot of blazing leads. Killing Time did have tempo variation, but a lot of it was just very straightforward, bull charge, just a wall of hate coming at you, which is actually one of the names of the songs on here. Very, very fucking heavy and metallic, but also maintaining that simplicity that made hardcore so beautiful and wonderful. Professional sounding. This album is produced incredibly well. It came out on In Effect Records in 1989. I've talked about In Effect before. It was a short-lived label that was fucking awesome, that had Agnostic Front, Sick of It All, Prong, 24/7 Spies, Nuclear Assault. What else? The Bad Brains Roar cassette got released on CD for the first time. This dude, Howie Abrams, ran In Effect and would go on to be the guy from Roadrunner that would sign Biohazard, Life of Agony, Madball, all that kind of stuff, Black Train Jack. A lot of people don't talk about Black Train Jack. I love Black Train Jack. So, very important, influential record. They don't kind of get their just due as much as bands that toured more, like AF and Cro-Mags and all that kind of stuff, just because they kind of stuck to the tri-state area. I picked up that tidbit in a podcast I was listening to the other day, the Old St. Vitus podcast from a couple of years ago. And that makes sense, but I think more and more, a lot of people are kind of referencing them as a influential band for good reason. 3/4 of these guys came from Breakdown, who had the earliest embryonic examples of like those kind of heavy thudding, rhythmically balanced kind of New York hardcore riffs. You'd hear those types of riffs later in Biohazard songs that kind of had more of a hip-hop-ish groove to them, but were like a thrash metal riff skeleton-wise. It's the best way to put it. If you listen to Sick People by Breakdown, that was kind of the first example of that as far as I know. So 3/4 of those guys that were in that lineup that kind of started inventing that style went on to form this band and really focus it a lot more. Later on, guitarists like Matt Henderson and Mike Dijon, who was a later member of Breakdown after they kind of reformed with new personnel, kind of developed it. I think, by the way, I mentioned in a much earlier update that Mike Dijon was a founding member of Breakdown, and I was totally wrong. So if you happen to go back and watch that, sorry, I'm an idiot. Okay, so that's Killing Time. Next up, we've got Leeway. This is their second album, Desperate Measures, which came out on Profile in 1991. This is also a game changer, also totally unique, also totally influential. Now, Born to Expire, their first album, I feel like comes closer to what would be considered crossover. It doesn't have those crazy tempo changes that, like I said, Ludacris and Crumbsuckers and stuff had. It was a little bit more like gallopy, straightforward, fast. You know, it had enough kind of bounce to it on the slower parts, but it was more of a mid-tempo to slightly fast kind of record with almost. It's weird trying to place Eddie Sutton's vocals because when he hits certain notes, he sounds like a traditional heavy metal vocalist. And at other times, he's totally doing his own thing. I've also been listening to interviews with that guy, and he talks about being very influenced by R&B and soul. And I can definitely hear that. It's almost like a new wave of British heavy metal or a speed metal guy that's been listening to a ton of Marvin Gaye or something. It's awesome. But he does kind of resemble some ways Joey Belladonna vocal range wise. Leeway on that first record almost sounds like a much less corny Anthrax, for lack of a much better way to put it. This record, however, Desperate Measures, is a different beast entirely. They still have those fast parts, but they've got a lot of big, expansive, fat riffs that breathe and get your head nodding. There's a lot more going on rhythmically. The drummer is the guy that's currently playing with Agnostic Front, and Eddie Sutton's vocal range is also expanding a lot on this. There's a great songwriting. I was always familiar with a couple of tracks. Kingpin song in the middle, there's a music video for that I've watched a whole bunch of times, but I'm kind of kicking myself for not getting into this earlier. It's an awesome record. You know, I was always just a Born to Expire only guy, and that was stupid. Next up, we got Chorus of Disapproval. This band is from California. Very New York sounding, though. They came from the Southern California area, I think Huntington Beach, if I'm not mistaken. They came from the ashes of a band called Visual Discrimination. And they were militant straight edge. And while towards the end of their career, a lot of other bands were going very metallic. It was the era of Conviction and Earth Crisis and tons of others, Chokehold, you know, a lot of bands that were kind of doing that riding the E, dive bomb kind of thing. Chorus had their roots in the late 80s and continued on till 92 or 93, I think, before they called it a day. And never really, they had plenty of crunch with their sound, but never really abandoned the fast, simplistic approach of early 80s hardcore, which when this came out sometime toward the mid 90s, I always really appreciated it just because there wasn't a lot of newer stuff coming out like this. Very vocally very similar to Mike Judge, those kind of spat, growled, sandpaper, angry gym teacher kind of vocals from Isaac Golub. I read somewhere the vocalist Isaac, his father died of a heroin overdose, and that rage towards that happening is very fucking palpable in the lyrics and the music here. Another interesting fact about this band, according to another interview I read with them, was that they were probably the first band to put the X's around the name for straight edge bands. So there's that. Interesting. This came out on New Age Records. I'd love to track down the original vinyl for all this stuff, but it was not in the cards for me financially at the time. Got a couple of Sick of It All records here. This is Live in a World Full of Hate. This is a great sounding live record. Raw, but everything's very audible. Recorded at the City Gardens in New Jersey. right after Just Look Around came out. Great documentary on the City Gardens out on Amazon Prime if you want to check it out. This great punk hardcore club that had a capacity of like 1,000 people. It was a big place. That's a really cool history if you want to check that out. But this record, it's got a lot of the hits from the first two. I love the first two, so I'm happy to listen to it. Lou's vocals are fucking unhinged on it, which is great. Lost and Found Records, who released it, were known as kind of a rip-off label. I know they did some semi-legit releases. They were a German label. And I gotta give them credit where credit's due. Before downloading was a widespread thing, you know, back in the dial-up days, I'd buy their comps for cheap. They had a comp called Hold Your Ground, a comp called In Crust We Trust, all these comps, and it was really the only way to hear kind of obscure, at the time, older bands like Urban Waste or, you know, Crude SS and all this kind of stuff. They bootlegged in a lot of cases, some legit, and put out all these bands that I couldn't find anywhere else. So thanks to Lost and Found for that. Sucks they ripped people off if they did. I know they did legit releases because I met Daryl Kahan from Citizen's Arrest and Funebrum and Disma. You know, that guy, he told me that the Citizen's Arrest semi-discography was legit. So I know some of it was legit, not sure if this was. And next up, another Sick of It All. Built to Last. This came out on a major. I can't read what the label was because my eyesight sucks and it's tiny. I'm not going to try. The last one they did for a label before they went on to Fat Records. I was a big fan of the first three. You know, they were extremely influential to me. I kept up with Sick of It All over the years because they were always good. I always went to see them live. Right now, I'm finally at a stage where I'm starting to check out their records after the first three. I was into Life on the Ropes when it came out. I just repurchased that on vinyl. I'll probably show it off at some point. I always checked out individual songs, especially in this YouTube era. They have great music videos. But I, on a recommendation from a couple of friends, I thought I'd pick this one up for cheap, my local Newbury Comics, and I don't regret it. It's got the same amount of energy and great production that Scratch the Surface had. Also, like, around the Scratch the Surface area, they're starting to kind of expand their sound. Everything's hardcore and punk, but they have certain songs that lean off kind of in a oi, catchy punk direction. They have other songs that are a little bit harder, that almost take like a 90s hardcore, slightly discordant kind of thing. They have a couple different things from their palette that they're using to paint whatever picture they're painting. And I really like this record a lot. It seems to be, it's a lot brighter sounding than the previous records, and it seems to have lean a little bit more towards the oi punk catchy kind of thing. Then we've got Side NYC, Ambitions Make Way for Dread. This came out on Gain Ground Records, which is a European label. I think it didn't come out till the late 90s. Yeah, it has an R.I.P. Rabies thing on the back, so it was 97 or 98 this came out. They did their first 7-inch a long time before that, which I also just bought, which was 1992. But this is Alan Blake, who was the guy who played for Sheer Terror in the early days and brought that very dirty, very heavily Hellhammer and Celtic Frost influenced guitar tone to Sheer Terror, and he continues it on this one. A handful of these songs are old Sheer Terror demo songs. Howard Unruh is one of them. You know, gruff vocals. The guy singing isn't doing a Paul Bearer imitation or anything. They're doing their own thing outside of the Sheer Terror influence. It's a little bit more moshy and groovish to it, kind of vibe to it, and it's really fucking great. I've been, again, a band that I downloaded years ago, and I was like, I gotta own something by these guys. Very hard. Needless to say, very dark. Dingy. It sounds like a basement show where you're just gonna get your ass kicked, basically. Fucking awesome. Then we've got Yuppicide, who are in a league of their own in the New York scene, I feel. Little background with them. They played a lot of different types of venues. They were a band that played ABC No Rio. That was like this really political DIY venue, if you haven't heard of it. That was kind of key in changing the New York scene. You know, this whole kind of circuit of hardcore bands that were a little bit off off the beaten path, off the cuff, like Citizen's Arrest, who I mentioned, Yuppicide, Rorschach, Go, all that. They were part of that. They played CBs too, which everybody did, I think. They were the first hardcore band that I ever saw live, and life-changing event, you know? I remember going to see them and their singer coming out in an elephant mask with super soakers, wearing a kilt. I had no idea what was going on. It was pretty wild. And their music had a certain dark, hard quality to it that could probably hold its own next to AF and Cro-Mags, but they would throw curveballs at you left and right with, you know, a ska song, a rockabilly song, that kind of thing, a metal song. And that was on their first record, Fear Love, which was stuff I think they'd been building up since the late 80s and writing and recording. Their second record, Shinebox, which over the years has become my personal favorite, was a lot more dark and personal. Still had the occasional curveball as far as like weird influences musically, but the faster, harder stuff was even more ferocious. They had a British vocalist who you could tell was British accent-wise that also added something a little bit different to their music that I really liked. They did a third record that I wasn't really into called Dead Man Walking, and then called it a day. And however many years later, 20 or 15 or whatever, they came out with this. This came out in 2015. This is Revenge, Regret, Repeat on Dead City Records. And I thought I'd pick it up because I love this band. It's good. It's a good record. It doesn't beat out Shinebox for me. It's about on the same par with their first one, Fear Love. It's a lot more straightforward, I feel like, than their earlier stuff. There's less curveballs, it seems like, but it's pissed and it's fast and it's punk as fuck. Vocals sound great. The lyrics are smart and insightful. So, Yuppicide, check it out if you want something a little different in your hardcore. This is Rejuvenate. This is Moment of Truth. This is a reissue that came out sometime in the 2000s on Dead Serious Recordings, who are European as well, I think. Rejuvenate was Tommy Rat, who was vocalist for Warzone for a period, I think. He ran Rat Cage Records, which is the label that put out AF, the first pressing of the Agnostic Front Victim in Pain record. They were like a little record store and label that were a big part of the New York scene in the early 80s. And this is just raw, fucking mean NYHC. Speaking of that Lost and Found label, there's a compilation that I mentioned called Hold Your Ground that had a couple of tracks from this on it, and I always wanted to just get the LP at some point, because Dis By You and Forward and Reverse are two of the hardest fucking songs. And actually, and I suck at crediting bands like during my intros, if you haven't noticed. I always forget to add the little note in or whatever. I can't be smart like Brain Smasher and actually put a thing at the bottom. But the last update I did was a Rejuvenate song called Wall of Ignorance, if you happen to like that song. But yeah, just slightly overdriven vocals. Sounds like crappy mic, but in a good way. Pretty deep, pretty raw sound, raw-throated kind of vocals, and mostly fast with the occasional good tempo change, kind of hard breakdown in there. Very punk-inspired hardcore. Tiny little bit of oi in there, a little bit, as far as the harshness and the catchiness of the choruses. Everything you'd want in a hardcore record. Nobody talks about these guys, and they're fucking awesome. I had to also pick this up. Just picked this up recently, and came down here to do laundry and listen to both albums in succession on the CD changer. Last but not least, a little buy one get one, a little twofer here. Madball's Demonstrating My Style and Look My Way, their second and third albums respectively. Two fucking killer hardcore records. I remember when Demonstrating My Style came out, I listened to it into the ground, even though everything else in my listening diet at the time was not that kind of hardcore at all. I was more into crust and crossover, thrash metal kind of stuff, and old punk, oi, that kind of shit. This was one of the few, like, kind of harder New York bands that I loved, just because they wrote such fucking good songs. Set It Off, their first album's a hardcore classic. There's still some reworked Agnostic Front material on it. Vinny Stigma plays on that album, and this one they're really coming into their own and writing a whole crop of new songs, and they just bring that sound into that decade so great on it. You know, it balances the kind of mid-paced, kind of harder, sort of breakdownish kind of stuff with plenty of fast material, which I always appreciated, loving the speed, you know, but the tempo variation in it really balances out really well. Freddie's vocals, monstrously scary, fucking hard as shit. And on Look My Way, which is a record that, you know, I've listened to here and there, and I really got into the last time I spun it. A lot of people say it's like a wicked underrated record. It wasn't really received super well at the time. I can sort of understand why, and on one hand and really not on the other. The production on it's fantastic. And Matt Henderson, the guitarist, produced it. It sounds massive. The guitars are thick as fucking molasses and it sounds great. They do involve a lot more like kind of slower groove kind of shit on it, but it's not in a shitty way at all. It makes the music way more impactful and hard hitting. There's enough fast on it to keep me sated, and I'm a speed freak for that kind of shit. Freddie's vocals are one of their best performances on any record that I've heard by them on it, and it's really fucking good. So yeah, ass kicker of a record, Look My Way from 1998. Demonstrating My Style came out in 96, which was my senior year of high school. Not that anybody gives a shit about that. But yeah, fucking good one. So, this is a mess. You know, so much to say. There's so much editing I gotta do to this. Whoo boy, it's gonna take a minute. But, now that's done. It's gonna be a general, just kind of collection update coming up next. And then I did a little poll. Thank you for participating if you did. Just seeing, I have a couple of different series that I like to do. And it looks like the one that got the most votes was Year of Our Lord. So that was actually the one that I wanted to do the most. So thanks for voting for that if you did. Till next time, take care.